Good morning and welcome to the BRR Legal Brief, where we're looking at the major legal issues affecting corporate Australia. I'm David Bushby, and today we're looking at the buyer limits for the upcoming $4 billion auction of mobile spectrum, which was announced last week by Federal Communications Minister Stephen Conroy. Here to discuss the auction and what it means for the telcos is Gilbert and Tobin's Peter Leonard. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Good morning, David.
Peter, if we can just start off with, I guess, the announcement. Can you run us through that and how the buyer limits will work?
Yeah. This announcement is really about the last phase of the reallocation of the so-called digital dividend, and that's the radio communications spectrum that is freed up as a result of broadcasters moving to other spectrum for both broadcast television and for news gathering. And so that frees up two blocks of spectrum that are very useful for a variety of uses, of which the highest value is mobile telecommunications. In essence, the freeing up enables 45 megahertz of spectrum to be made available in the lower band. And the common industry view is that around 20 megahertz is necessary to establish a viable mobile service. So in essence, it creates the possibility of a new entrant coming in and buying a 20 megahertz block, or the existing mobile operators bidding for additional spectrum to supplement their existing spectrum and their existing networks. Either way, what the restriction that Minister Conroy has announced will do is limit the amount that any one buyer can buy to 20 megahertz. As I said, the minimum that you'd need to establish a new network. So that's the maximum that any one person can buy, whether a new operator or an existing carrier. And there's 45 megahertz available and 3 existing operators, so it looks like we potentially have competition to lead to an auction and a high price for the government.
And Peter, if we can just, I guess, stick with this, and wondering if you could take us through the current state of mobile spectrum ownership in this country and how this auction could change that landscape.
Sure. Well, the existing mobile operators operate in a different part of the spectrum for their 2G and 3G services, but the licences that they were allocated for that spectrum come up for renewal shortly. And just before this announcement, the Minister announced the price that the government required for the renewal of licences in that spectrum. And in aggregate, it's around $3 billion that the government is requiring from the existing carriers if they wish to renew their licences in that spectrum. So for carriers like Vodafone and Telstra, they have a choice. They can either renew their existing licences and take advantage of their existing infrastructure, or they can bid for the new spectrum and build new infrastructure to serve the use of that spectrum, or both. But it's going to be about money, and it's serious money.
Well, just speaking about the money factor, is it just a matter of how deep the pockets are for the telcos, or are there other factors at play that will limit the amount, will determine the band that the telcos get and how much of it they do get?
Well, of course, the spectrum limits that the Minister announced will mean that no one can get more than 20 megahertz of the new spectrum. The big question for carriers is how much money is to be made in using spectrum going forward. And certainly to date, the average revenue per mobile phone has been declining. And what's been happening, of course, is there's intense competition in mobile phone plans that's driving down price, while at the same time the use of spectrum is dramatically increasing. So for carriers, it's a difficult pricing question going forward as to how much they can charge customers for the use of spectrum, how much spectrum customers will want in the new NBN world, and of course recovering the very large fees that they will have to pay to the government to acquire spectrum. For example, if they're renewing an existing licence and paying of the order of $1 billion for that, and also bidding for new spectrum and potentially paying another $1 billion for that, that's $2 billion even before you start establishing the infrastructure to use that, the networks. And the networks typically would be a spend in excess of $1 billion as well. So we're talking about an expenditure for major carriers probably in excess of $3 billion.
Well, there's certainly a lot at stake financially, and you also mentioned the new NBN world. I just want to finish up with exploring that a bit further. How will that, when the NBN is more fully rolled out, affect the competitive landscape between the telcos?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because what we're increasingly seeing is close integration between fixed broadband and mobile. So if you're like me, when you want a new smartphone app, you often won't download it when you're out and about. You'll wait till you get home and download it on your home network linked into the broadband network. And what I think we'll see as we go forward is that a lot of content-rich applications that might be expensive to download on mobile phones, people will download over the NBN, and they will use their mobile phones for content that is more highly valuable because it's time sensitive. So to a certain extent, the NBN and mobile broadband will be competitive, but I think for many users and many services, they will be increasingly closely integrated together.
We'll certainly keep a close eye on the auction and see how it all pans out for the industry, and we'll leave it there today. And thank you again for your time today, Peter.
Thanks, David.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We look forward to having your company next week for the BRR Legal Brief. See you then.